He had stared down droughts, buried cattle, and rebuilt his ranch from nothing with his bare hands. But the one thing that finally broke Wade Mercer wasn't a storm, a debt, or a dying season. It was a woman standing at a creek in fading afternoon light, looking at him like she already knew every scar he'd tried to hide. And the worst part? He'd been looking right through her for years. If you've ever been too afraid to reach for the one thing you wanted most, stay until the end. Drop your city in the comments. Let's see how far this story travels. The summer that changed everything started the same way every other summer had. Badly. Wade Mercer woke before the sun, the same as always, to a sky the color of a bruise and air so dry it cracked the corners of his mouth before he'd even had his coffee. He stood on the porch of the ranch house with a tin cup in one hand and a list of problems in the other, reading through the damages the night had left behind, the way a doctor reads a chart on a dying patient, systematically, without sentiment, because sentiment didn't fix anything out here. 2 fence posts along the south pasture had buckled overnight. The creek that cut across the lower quarter of his property was running shallower than he'd ever seen it this early in the season. One of the mares, the roan named Clara, was favoring her left foreleg again, which meant a vet bill he hadn't budgeted for, assuming Doc Harlan was even still making ranch calls since his wife had taken ill back in March. Wade drained the rest of his coffee, set the cup on the porch rail, and went to work. That was the shape of his life at 34. Not unhappy, exactly. Not happy either, just functional. He existed the way a good tool exists, reliably, without complaint, purpose-built for hard use. The Mercer Ranch had been in his family for 3 generations, and Wade had inherited it the way you inherit a debt, with full knowledge of what it cost and little choice about whether to accept it. His father had worked it, his grandfather before that. And now it was his 412 acres of scrub grass, red clay, and stubbornness, tucked into a valley east of Blackstone Ridge, where the mountains caught the weather and squeezed it dry before it could do much good. He'd been running it alone for 6 years. Not that he planned it that way. His younger brother, Cole, had left for Denver the year after their father died, chasing some notion about railroad contracts and a woman named Frances, who turned out to be married to someone else. Cole sent money when he could, and letters that were mostly apologies. Wade sent money back when Cole asked for it, and letters that were shorter than they should have been. That was their relationship now. Functional, like most things in Wade's life. Kept in working order, not examined too closely. He didn't have friends, not in any real sense. He had neighbors he respected and a few men he'd drink with at the Dusty Lantern on the first Friday of the month when he allowed himself that particular indulgence. He had a reputation for being square in his dealings and slow to anger and almost impossible to know. And he had the ranch. That was enough. He told himself that so many times it had stopped feeling like a lie and started feeling like weather, just a condition of the landscape he inhabited. The Bennetts lived on the property that bordered his to the northwest, separated by a stretch of scrubland and the winding creek that both families shared water rights to. Their spread was smaller than his, maybe 180 acres, but Thomas Bennett ran it with a kind of cheerful tenacity that Wade had always privately admired and never said so. Thomas was the sort of man who could lose half his corn crop to a late frost and spend the next morning whistling while he replanted. His wife, Ruth, was a round-faced woman with quick eyes and flour perpetually on her apron who had a habit of sending food over to Wade's place whenever she suspected he wasn't eating properly, which was most of the time. They had 2 children. Their son Daniel was 17 and already as broad across the shoulders as his father. And they had Eliza. Eliza Bennett was 26 years old that summer, and she had lived her entire life in Blackstone Ridge, and everyone who knew her seemed to understand something about her that Wade had somehow managed to miss for most of the decade they'd been neighbors. He would think about that later when he was older, and it would embarrass him in a way that drought and debt never had. How clearly she had been visible to everyone else. How completely he had failed to see her. Not that he'd been blind. He knew who she was. You couldn't live next to someone for 10 years without knowing them in the surface-level way of neighboring, the way you know the terrain, where the soft ground is, where the fence lines run. He knew she helped her mother with the younger families down in the valley, who had nobody else. He knew she'd taught herself to read surveying maps well enough to help her father dispute a property line with the Garfield brothers 3 years back, and that she'd been right about the survey, and the Garfields had backed down, which almost nobody made the Garfields do. He knew she had a brown horse named Copper that she rode like she'd been born in the saddle. He knew these things the way you know the shape of a mountain you pass every day. Present, acknowledged, not really looked at. Until the fence. The creek flood had been worse than he initially thought. 3 days of rain in early July, real rain, the kind Blackstone Ridge almost never got, had pushed the water up over its banks along the stretch where his property met the Bennetts. And when it receded, it took about 60 feet of shared fence line with it, leaving a gap in the boundary that both families' livestock could wander through if nobody dealt with it. Wade rode out there on a Thursday morning with fence wire and post digger and an attitude that was mostly impatience. He wanted the job done. He had 12 other things that needed doing, and standing around in the mud where the creek had overflowed wasn't how he'd planned his day. He'd been working for maybe an hour when he heard hoofbeats and looked up to see Eliza Bennett coming down the slope on Copper, a coil of wire looped over her saddle horn and a pair of work gloves already on her hands. "Dad sent me," she said, dismounting before the horse had fully stopped, which was the kind of move that told you everything about how long she'd been riding. He was going to come himself, but he's got a ewe with twin lambs stuck, both of them, and he can't leave it. "I've got it," Wade said. Not unkindly, just factually. "I know you've got it." She tied Copper to a cedar post and pulled the wire coil off the saddle. "That's not why I'm here. The fence is half ours." He couldn't argue with that, so he didn't. They worked in silence for a while, which was fine by Wade. He wasn't much of a talker while he worked. She didn't seem to need him to be. She handled the wire with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done it 100 times, stretching it tight before securing it, checking the tension, not making a production of any of it. He noticed she'd brought better wire than he had, a heavier gauge that would hold up better in a flood, and that she'd thought to bring extra staples in her vest pocket without being asked. "Your south corner's sitting low," she said after a while, nodding toward where the post met the creek bank. "Water's going to undercut it again if you don't reset it." Wade looked where she was pointing. She was right. He'd been planning to leave it for now and address it later, which he recognized even as he thought it was the kind of deferred decision that caused bigger problems. "I'll get to it," he said. "I can hold the post if you want to tamp it now, while the ground's still soft." He looked at her. She was standing in creek mud up to her boot ankles, her dark hair tucked back under a battered hat, squinting slightly against the morning glare off the water. There was nothing performative about her. She wasn't there to impress anyone or be seen being capable. She was just doing the work. Because the work needed doing. "All right," he said. It took another 40 minutes to reset the post properly, the two of them working around each other with surprisingly little friction for people who hadn't spent much time in proximity before. She held the post plumb while he packed the earth tight around it. She handed him the level without him asking for it. When the tamping bar slipped and caught his knuckle, she said, "You okay?" without looking up from what she was doing, and when he said, "Fine," she didn't make a fuss about it, just waited for him to stop swearing under his breath, and then went back to her end of the job. When they were done, she stepped back and looked at the repaired line. "That'll hold," she said. She said it with a kind of quiet satisfaction that wasn't pride exactly, more like completion. Like a person who takes finishing something seriously. "Thank you," Wade said. The words came out more sincerely than he'd intended. She looked at him for a moment, and there was something in that look he couldn't quite read. Not quite surprise, but something adjacent to it, like someone hearing a sound they'd been waiting for and weren't sure they actually had. "Tell your father I hope the lambs come through," he added. "I will." She untied Copper, swung up into the saddle with that same economy of motion she did everything with, and rode back up the slope toward the Bennett place. Wade stood by the repaired fence for a few minutes after she was gone, looking at the creek running shallow and brown and busy over its rocky bed. He had the strange sensation that something had shifted in the air, the way the pressure changes before a storm rolls in. Not threatening, just different, a change in conditions. He picked up his tools and went back to work. But he kept thinking about the level she'd handed him before he'd asked for it. He saw her 3 more times over the next 2 weeks, by circumstance rather than intention, or so he told himself. Once at the feed store in town, where they stood in the same line and talked for about 7 minutes about the quality of the current season's alfalfa and whether Hennessy's mill would be grinding corn again before fall. Once on the road between their properties, when she was leading Copper home after what looked like a long ride and he was headed the same direction in the wagon. He'd offered her a lift, which she'd declined in favor of walking with the horse, and then, for reasons he couldn't entirely explain, he'd slowed the wagon to walking pace anyway, and they'd covered most of the mile between there and the turnoff to the Bennett place side by side, talking about nothing much, which was to say they talked about the county fair and the Whitfield family's water dispute, and whether the dry spell was going to break before it did permanent damage to the lower pastures. And once in the evening, when he'd ridden out to check his fence line at dusk and found her sitting on a flat rock at the creek's edge, with her boots off, feet dangling in the water, reading something. A thick, battered book he couldn't make out the title of. She looked up when she heard him coming, not startled, just aware. "I'm not on your side," she said, nodding at the opposite bank. "I know," he said. He reined the horse to a stop. "Good book?" She considered the question seriously, which he was starting to understand was how she considered most things. "It's the kind of book that makes you feel slightly stupid," she said, "which usually means it's worth finishing." He laughed. He couldn't remember the last time something had made him laugh like that, sudden and genuine and a little surprised by itself. She smiled at the sound of it, and there was warmth in that smile that he felt all the way across the creek, which struck him as unusual, and then struck him as something else, something he didn't have a word for yet. "Tell me when you've finished it," he said, "whether it was worth it." "I will," she said. He rode on, but he carried that smile the rest of the way home like something he'd picked up off the ground and wasn't sure what to do with. He didn't talk about her to anyone. This was partly because he didn't talk to anyone about much of anything personal, and partly because he wasn't sure what he would have said. He was aware of something, some new presence in his thinking that hadn't been there before. The way you become suddenly aware of a sound you've been hearing without registering, a drip, a creak, a bird outside a window, that once noticed becomes impossible to ignore. He knew things about her that he hadn't known before, and now that he knew them, he couldn't understand how he'd failed to for so long. He knew that she had quietly organized the effort to rebuild the Hanley family's barn after it burned in May, calling in favors from half the county without ever making it seem like a project she was running. He knew she had a sharp, dry sense of humor that only emerged when she was comfortable, and that most people in Blackstone Ridge seemed to be comfortable around her faster than they were around almost anyone else. He knew she woke early and worked hard and didn't complain about either, not because she was performing stoicism, but because complaining seemed to genuinely bore her. He found himself noticing these things the way you notice the details of a landscape when you're finally paying attention to it rather than just moving through it. Thomas Bennett mentioned her in passing one afternoon when Wade rode over to return a borrowed tool, and the mention was so casual. "Eliza's in town with her mother today, otherwise she'd have coffee on." That Wade realized the Bennetts had apparently accepted his occasional presence on their porch as unremarkable, which meant he'd been stopping by more often than he'd consciously tracked. That was when he started to understand he had a problem. The problem was not that he felt something. Feelings, in Wade's experience, were like weather. They arrived without your consent, and there wasn't much point being upset about them. The problem was what he did next. He was 34 years old, and he had spent the better part of a decade constructing a life that was deliberately, carefully, systematically protected from the kind of risk that opened you up. The ranch demanded everything he had and gave back enough to justify the expense. That was a transaction he understood. Hard work, reasonable return, no surprises. He knew what droughts cost. He knew what a bad calf season looked like. He knew how to absorb those losses and continue, because they were the known losses, the budgeted-for catastrophes. What he did not know how to absorb was the particular category of loss that came from wanting something you couldn't earn through work. His mother had died when he was 11. Not dramatically, pneumonia, one bad winter, and then she was gone, and his father had folded inward like a building losing its load-bearing wall, and spent the rest of his life being present in the body, but somewhere else entirely in any way that mattered. Wade had watched that happen. He'd been watching it since he was old enough to understand what he was seeing, and somewhere in that watching he had absorbed a lesson that he'd never put into words because it didn't need words. The price of loving something is the size of the hole it leaves. He was not interested in holes. This was the argument he made to himself on the nights when he sat on the porch after the work was done and the house was dark and quiet around him. "You're fine. You're stable. You've built something here. Don't complicate it. The argument was sound. He'd been making it for years and it had served him well. The problem was that it had started to sound in a way it never had before, like a man trying to talk himself out of something he'd already decided. The Harvest Festival was held in town every August, the same weekend every year, which meant the same things every year. A pie contest that Mabel Rutherford won with suspicious regularity, a fiddle competition that got rowdy after dark, several men who ought to know better challenging each other to feats of strength in the main square, and most of the county's ranching families gathered in the same space at the same time, which made it impossible to avoid anyone even if you were inclined to try. Wade went because it would have been more conspicuous not to. He stood at the edge of things, as was his habit, with a beer he was drinking slowly, watching the crowd with the mild attention of a man who wasn't looking for anything in particular. He found Eliza without looking for her. That seemed to be how it went now. She was standing with a group of women near the pie tables, listening to something the older of the Henderson sisters was saying with an expression of careful attention that he recognized now. She gave that expression to everything, that quality of genuine listening, like the person in front of her had said something worth hearing even when they probably hadn't. She was wearing a blue dress he hadn't seen before, her hair loose around her shoulders instead of tucked back under a work hat, and she looked, in a way that he hadn't expected to be ambushed by, entirely different from the woman in creek mud and work gloves, and also completely the same. Abner Whitfield appeared at Wade's elbow, beer in hand, following his gaze. "You know she turned down Caleb Harrington twice," Abner said, in the tone of a man who thinks he's contributing useful information. "I didn't know that," Wade said, keeping his voice even. "Last spring and the spring before." He asked proper both times. Her father confirmed it. Abner sipped his beer. "Can't figure out what she's waiting for, personally. Harrington's not a bad man." "No," Wade agreed. "He's not." Abner gave him a look that Wade chose not to examine. "You ought to come out to the barn dance after. Margaret's been asking after you." "Tell Margaret I appreciate that," Wade said, which was not a yes. He watched Eliza laugh at something. Real laughter. Head back slightly, hand coming up to cover her mouth in a reflex she had, and he felt something contract in his chest that was almost painful. He finished his beer and went home before the fiddle competition started. He sat on his porch in the dark for a long time. Caleb Harrington, he thought, twice. He was not sure what he was supposed to do with that. He was not sure he was supposed to do anything with it. He sat with it the way you sit with a piece of information that rearranges something without you having asked it to. The night was very quiet. The stars were the particular dense brilliance they got out here when the humidity was low, so thick they looked like something poured rather than placed. Wade looked at them without seeing them. He was afraid. He knew the shape of his own fear well enough to recognize it, even if he'd spent years pretending it was something more respectable. Caution, practicality, realism. It was none of those things. It was just fear. The simple, humiliating variety. The kind that made a grown man sit on his porch at night rather than walk across a field and say something honest to a woman who'd handed him a fence level without being asked and smiled at him from across a creek, and apparently turned down a perfectly decent man twice for reasons he was only now beginning to allow himself to consider. He was afraid of wanting this, because if he wanted it, it could be taken from him. And he was not, he had decided a long time ago, going to give anything else the chance to be taken from him. Sub. He threw himself into work the way he always did when something needed not thinking about. He repaired the barn roof. He redug the irrigation channel along the east field. He replaced 3 sections of the south fence that had been deteriorating since before the flood. He drove into town and had a long practical conversation with Orson Graves at the bank about refinancing options for the ridge acreage, which was a conversation he'd been putting off for months. He worked from before sunrise until dark and fell into bed and slept hard and dreamlessly, and got up and did it again. It didn't work. That was the thing about having spent your whole life being good at managing problems. When you finally ran up against one that didn't yield to effort, it was genuinely disorienting. He had no protocol for this. Every other difficulty in his life had a procedure: assess, plan, work, resolve. This one sat in his chest and resisted all of that with the serene immovability of a boulder in a field that the plow has to go around every time. He thought about her at the most inconvenient moments. not in any swooning, feverish way. He was not that kind of man, and this was not that kind of story, but in the persistent, ordinary way of someone who's become necessary to your thinking. He'd be assessing the cattle and find himself wondering what she would make of the season's numbers. He'd be reading over his accounts at night and hear, in his memory, her voice saying, "It's the kind of book that makes you feel slightly stupid," which usually means it's worth finishing. And he'd set his pen down and stare at the ceiling. He had not been back to the Bennett place since the festival. He told himself this was respectful of the distance he'd decided to maintain. He told himself a lot of things. It was Ruth Bennett who ended his self-imposed exile, efficiently and without apparent awareness that she was doing anything other than being neighborly. She appeared at his door on a Tuesday morning in mid-August, with a covered dish that turned out to contain a beef stew substantial enough to feed 3 men, which she handed to him with the matter-of-fact generosity of someone who feeds people the way other people breathe. "You look like you've been forgetting meals again," she said, looking him over with the frank appraisal of a woman who had raised children and thus had no illusions about the self-neglect habits of men living alone. "I've been eating," he said. She looked unconvinced. "Eliza made that. She made a double batch. You might as well have the other half." He thanked her. He stood in his doorway holding a dish that Eliza Bennett had made and was aware of the profound inadequacy of everything he was doing. "She's going to help with the late harvest at the Hanley place next week," Ruth said, adjusting her shawl and preparing to leave in the way of someone who has delivered what they came to deliver. "If you've got the time, Thomas could use another hand for the post-harvest fence survey. Creeks shifted the property line in 2 places, and he'd value a second opinion." She said this with perfect neutrality, as a purely practical suggestion. "Tell him I'll ride over Saturday," Wade said. Ruth smiled at him, the small private smile of a woman who has been patient for a long time and has learned that patience eventually produces results. He ate the stew alone at his kitchen table, and it was the best meal he'd had in months, and that fact made him feel about 17 kinds of foolish. He rode over Saturday. Thomas was out in the west field with Daniel when Wade arrived, and Eliza was in the kitchen garden behind the house, crouched down between rows of late-season beans, working methodically through the weeding. She looked up when she heard him coming around the corner, and there was briefly, so briefly he almost missed it, something in her face that was not quite surprise, not quite relief, but somewhere between the two. "Dad's in the west pasture," she said. "I know. I'll find him." He stopped, though, rather than going on. He stood there like a man with somewhere to be who has forgotten why he was going. "That stew was... Your mother said you made it." "She told you that, did she?" Eliza said, and there was something dry and knowing in her voice that told him Ruth Bennett's errand had been considerably less casual than it appeared. "It was good," he said, which was inadequate, but it was what came out. "I'm glad," she said. She was looking at him steadily, her hands resting on her knees, the weeding temporarily suspended, and he had the distinct impression that she was waiting for something. Not impatiently, just waiting. The way she did most things, with attention, without performance. He should have said something. He knew he should have said something. He had something to say. It was right there, in the vicinity of his chest, pressing against his sternum like it wanted out. What he said instead was, "I should go find your father." Something shifted in her expression. Not hurt, not quite. Something more careful. She nodded once. "He's at the far end of the west pasture. You'll see the orange flags where the survey stakes are." "Thank you," he said. He went to find Thomas. He spent the next 4 hours doing survey work in a field in the August heat, and being one of the most productive and least present workers Thomas Bennett had ever shared a fence line with, and he knew it, and there was nothing he could do about it. On the ride home, crossing the flat stretch between their properties where the scrubland went silver in the late afternoon light, Wade Mercer had what might fairly be called a reckoning with himself. He went over the list, the complete and honest accounting. He was afraid. Yes, he had established that. The fear was real, and it wasn't going anywhere, and he had been trying to manage it through avoidance, which was the approach of a coward, and he knew it. He had spent 6 years building a life that was proof against loss because he had decided, at 11 years old watching his father diminish, that the price of love was too high. He had built solid fences around himself the same way he built them on his property, functional, strong, designed to hold. But Eliza Bennett had handed him a level before he'd asked for it, and fixed a fence beside him in creek mud without complaint, and smiled at him from across the water in the evening light. And somewhere in those small, ordinary moments, the fences had acquired not a hole, exactly, more like a gate. That had never happened before. He didn't know what to do with a gate. He pulled the horse up on the ridge above his property and looked out at the valley spread below him. His fields, the creek winding through the lower quarter, the Bennett place visible over the rise to the northwest, smoke coming from their chimney in the cooling air. He thought about Caleb Harrington. Twice. He thought about Thomas Bennett saying, casually, as if it were simply observable fact, "Wade, you're a man who knows how to hold on to things," said during the fence survey about his property line, about the way he'd maintained the old Mercer boundaries through 3 difficult years. You're a man who knows how to hold on to things. He sat on the ridge for a long time. Then he rode down. The fear did not go away. He had not expected it to. But something had changed in the way he was carrying it. Not heavier, not lighter, but differently oriented, the way you shift a load on your back to distribute the weight better for the long haul. He had a decision to make. He wasn't done being afraid of it yet. But for the first time in a long time, the fear was no longer the only voice in the room. Berstedt. He slept badly that night. And the night after. On the 3rd night, he gave up on sleep around 2 in the morning, lit the lamp, and sat at his kitchen table with a blank piece of paper and a pen, and wrote down, in the cramped, practical handwriting of a man who kept records, the things he knew. He wrote, "She turned down a decent man twice." He wrote, "She handed me the level." He wrote, "She smiles at me like she's been waiting." He sat looking at what he'd written. Then he wrote one more line, which was not an observation, but which was the most honest thing on the page. "I'm tired of being safe." He folded the paper and put it in the top drawer of the kitchen table, where he kept his surveying notes and his father's old watch, and a few other things he didn't take out often but needed to know were there. He blew out the lamp. He lay in the dark and listened to the ranch settle around him. The sounds of the horses in the pasture, the creek running somewhere beyond the east fence, the particular silence of land you've cared for over years, the silence of something that knows you. He had built this place, with his hands, with his father's memory, with 6 years of solitary, stubborn effort. He had made something real here. He thought, maybe that's enough foundation to risk something on. He didn't sleep much even after that. But what sleep came was, for the first time in weeks, free of the particular restlessness that had been following him like a shadow. Outside, the creek kept running, carrying water from the mountains down through the valley, crossing the boundary between his land and the Bennetts the way it always had, indifferent to the lines men drew on paper, following its own course through the dark. The paper in the kitchen drawer didn't solve anything. Wade had half expected it to, or if not solve anything, at least settle something, the way writing a number down in a ledger makes it real and manageable and less likely to ambush you at 2 in the morning. But the days after his late-night accounting had the same unresolved quality as the days before it, and he moved through them with the low-grade restlessness of a man waiting for weather that keeps threatening and doesn't arrive. September came in dry and merciless. The creek dropped another 2 inches. He lost a section of the east irrigation channel to a collapse he should have caught earlier, and spent the better part of 3 days in the ditch fixing it, which was dirty, exhausting work that he was almost grateful for because it left him too tired in the evenings for anything more complicated than eating and sleeping. Almost. He saw Eliza at the county road on a Wednesday when she was headed into town with her mother in the Bennett wagon, and he was coming the other direction. They stopped side by side on the road, the way people do in open country, where there's no reason to pretend you haven't seen each other. Ruth Bennett smiled at him from the bench seat with the serene warmth of a woman who has made her peace with the pace of other people's realizations. Eliza sat beside her mother and looked at him with an expression that was careful and unreadable in a way it hadn't been before. Before being the day in the garden when he'd said I should go find your father, and she had nodded once, and the something between them had gone quieter. He'd done that. He knew he'd done that. "Heading to Hennessy's?" he asked, because it was the only thing to say. "Feed order," Eliza said, "and Mother wants ribbon from Caldwell's." "We're having supper together after, if you'd care to join us," Ruth said, with what Wade was beginning to recognize as her particular brand of transparent strategy, which she deployed without apology because she had long since concluded that subtlety was wasted on men of a certain type. "I've got the irrigation work," he said. "You work too much," Ruth said pleasantly, in the tone of a woman stating an observable fact rather than making a complaint. "Yes, ma'am," he agreed, which was not a denial. They moved on in their respective directions. Wade rode another 50 yards down the road before he allowed himself to glance back. Eliza was looking straight ahead. Her hands were folded in her lap. Her back was very straight. He turned forward and kept riding and felt like a man who has just passed something important on the road and kept walking anyway out of sheer stubbornness. The irrigation work that evening was worse than he remembered it being during the day, which was a thing that sometimes happened with hard jobs. They expanded when you were alone with them in the fading light. He worked until he couldn't see, then walked back to the house with mud to his knees and sat on the porch steps and didn't go inside for a long time. He'd hurt her feelings. Or not hurt them exactly. Eliza Bennett was not the kind of woman who let her feelings get hurt easily, or at least not the kind who showed it. But he dimmed something. That careful expression on the road was different from the one at the creek in the evenings. That one had been open. The one today had been managed. He had made her manage herself around him, which was the thing he'd been afraid of doing to her before he understood that his avoidance was its own kind of damage. He sat with that for a while and didn't enjoy it. Inside, on the kitchen table, was a letter from Cole that had arrived 2 days ago and that he hadn't opened yet. He went in and opened it now, standing at the table in his muddy boots, reading his brother's slanted handwriting by lamplight. Cole was back in Denver. The railroad contract had come through after all. A surveying job, good money, solid work. He'd met a woman, a widow named Margaret. Not the Margaret from Blackstone Ridge, a different one, a Denver Margaret. And she had 2 boys and was, as Cole described her, a person of excellent sense who has somehow not yet realized the full extent of my shortcomings. He wanted to know how the ranch was. He wanted to know how Wade was, which Cole asked in the way younger brothers ask, directly, without the pretense that the answer might not be required. "You still alone out there?" Cole had written, near the end. "I know you think that's the smart way to run a life. I used to think so too before Francis. Not the married one, the one after. But you know what I figured out? The smart way and the right way are different things about half the time, and spending your life being smart about it just means you get to be very correct and very alone at the end of it, which is not as satisfying as it sounds." Wade folded the letter and put it in the drawer with the paper. He looked at the 2 pieces of paper in the drawer for a moment before closing it. His brother had never been particularly wise, but every now and then he got there by accident. The harvest season arrived in earnest the 3rd week of September, and with it came the particular rhythm of ranching country in autumn. The whole valley pulling together in the way it always did when the work was bigger than any single property, neighbor helping neighbor with the pragmatic solidarity of people who understood that this year's help was next year's debt repaid. Wade hired 2 extra hands for the month and spent most of his daylight hours in the fields or with the cattle, working through the systematic demands of the season with the focused efficiency that was his best quality. He also, unavoidably, spent more time around the Bennetts. It wasn't by design, or not entirely. It was simply that harvest season made the property line between them more permeable than it was the rest of the year. Thomas had 300 acres of hay to cut and bale and not enough hands to do it efficiently, and Wade had equipment Thomas lacked, and the exchange of labor and equipment was how this valley had always operated. So Wade brought his cutting rig over on a Tuesday, and he and Thomas and Daniel and 2 of Wade's hired men worked through the Bennett fields for 3 days, and Eliza brought water and food out to the workers at midday and in the late afternoon, which was work she did without ceremony. A bucket, a ladle, biscuits in a cloth, sometimes a pot of something substantial if the day was running long. On the second afternoon, she brought coffee along with the water, which was unusual. She moved down the line of workers and Wade was at the end of the line, and she poured him a cup last, and then instead of going back to the house, she sat down in the shade of the cutting rig and watched the clouds moving over the ridge to the west. He sat nearby. Not close, but nearby. "Rain coming?" he said. "Probably not." She had the coffee pot in her lap, her skirt spread on the dry grass. "That ridge usually breaks it up, but it looks like it might. We should get the north section cut before dark either way." She was quiet for a moment, then without particular inflection, You've been avoiding me." He didn't deny it. He looked at the cloud bank over the ridge and said, "I know. I'm not asking you to explain it," she said. I noticed, and I'd rather say it out loud than pretend I didn't." This was, he thought, characteristic of her. The preference for the thing said plainly over the comfortable pretense. He respected it even when it made him uncomfortable, which was now. It wasn't... He stopped, started again. "It wasn't about you, what I was avoiding." She looked at him then. "I know what you were avoiding," she said. The directness of it caught him somewhere in the chest. He looked at her, and she held the look without flinching, and the thing between them was no longer small or incidental or deniable. It was right there in the air between them, as present and plain as the hayfield and the approaching clouds. He opened his mouth. "Wade." Thomas Bennett's voice came from across the field. "You want to take the north section before we lose the light?" Wade looked away from Eliza. "Yeah," he called back. "Give me a minute." When he looked back at her, she was standing, smoothing her skirt, the coffee pot in hand. Her expression was composed but not closed, something held carefully rather than locked away. "Go," she said. "The hay won't cut itself." He went. He cut hay until the light was gone and the clouds had moved on without delivering their rain, and he went home and ate standing up at the kitchen counter and lay in bed for a long time, not sleeping, replaying those few minutes in the shade of the cutting rig, with the persistence of a man who knows something important happened and is still working out what to do about it. "I know what you were avoiding." She knew. She had known, probably, for longer than he had. And she was still, there was no other word for it, still there, still bringing coffee, still sitting nearby, still looking at him with that expression that was patient but not waiting to be asked permission. He turned this over in the dark. He thought about what it would cost her, in a town like Blackstone Ridge, to have made herself that visible. The valley talked. Everyone knew everyone's business, or thought they did, and a woman who had turned down Caleb Harrington twice and who was now, what exactly? Waiting? Hoping? The valley had its opinions about women who waited and hoped openly, most of those opinions being the kind that attached themselves to a reputation and stayed there. She had done it anyway. That took a kind of courage that made his own fear look small. He wasn't entirely ready to act on that observation yet. But it had moved into him and taken up residence in a place that was hard to ignore. The Blackstone Ridge Harvest Social was held at the Rutherford Barn the last Saturday of September, the same as always. It was both a practical gathering, final tallies on the season, crop exchange arrangements, equipment loans settled up, and a social one, which meant the Rutherford Barn got cleaned out and lanterns strung, and someone rolled a piano in from somewhere, and the better part of the valley showed up with food and an excuse to stop working for one night. Wade went. He'd decided to go early and leave early, which was his standard strategy for these events. He did not leave early. He stayed because Eliza was there, and because watching her move through a room full of people she'd known her whole life, easy with the older women, patient with the children who latched onto her skirt, genuinely warm rather than performatively social, was something he found he was not ready to walk away from at the hour he'd planned to. He talked to Orson Graves about the bank situation and to Pete Calloway about a bull. Pete was trying to sell, and to Doc Harlan, who had made it out after all, about Clara the mare's foreleg, which was improving slowly. He did not go talk to Eliza, who was across the room, who was aware of where he was in the same way he was aware of where she was, which was a thing he felt as a kind of warm pressure even when he wasn't looking in her direction. Caleb Harrington was there. Wade registered this fact with an objectivity he was not entirely proud of. Harrington was a decent man. He'd said so to Abner Whitfield, and he meant it. 30, maybe 31, with a good spread east of town and a steady temperament and a face that was pleasant enough. He spent 40 minutes talking to Eliza near the food tables, and Eliza was polite and pleasant with him in the way she was pleasant with everyone. And at no point did she look at Harrington the way she'd looked at Wade in the shade of the cutting rig, which was something Wade noticed and then felt guilty about noticing. Harrington was decent. He didn't deserve to be measured against anything, but he didn't look at her quite right. That was the thing Wade kept coming back to, even knowing he should leave it alone. Harrington looked at Eliza the way you look at something you want, which was fine, which was natural, but not the way you look at something you see. There was a difference. Wade had spent most of his adult life not understanding that difference. He was only beginning to understand it now, which was part of what made him angry at himself. He'd needed this long to see what was apparently visible to everyone. Near 10 o'clock, Eliza ended up at the edge of the room where Wade was standing, having worked her way gradually in that direction over the course of the evening. She had a plate of food that she wasn't really eating and an expression that was, for once, slightly less composed than usual, a hairline crack in the careful surface, visible if you were paying attention. "Long night," she said. "Not so bad," he said. Then, "Harrington's been following you around for about 2 hours." She looked at him sideways. "I know. He's a decent man. I'm aware of that too." Her voice was level, but there was something underneath it, a sharpness, contained but present. "Did you come over here to tell me about Caleb Harrington's qualities?" "No," he said. "Then why did you come over here?" He stood there. He had an answer. It was the same answer he'd been carrying around for weeks, heavy and real and terrifying. And he was right on the edge of it, close enough to feel the shape of it. And then the fiddle player started up a reel, and 2 of the Whitfield boys nearly knocked them both over chasing each other through the crowd, and the moment broke apart. Eliza caught his arm to keep her balance and then let go quickly, and for a moment they were standing close enough that he could see the lamplight in her eyes. And what was in her eyes was not patience. It was something sharper than patience. It was a question that had been asked many times and was getting tired of waiting for an answer. He should have spoken. He didn't. He let the fiddle music and the noise fill the space, and the moment passed, and she stepped back and said, "I should check on Mrs. Hanley," and moved away into the crowd, and he stood there and watched her go. He left the Rutherford barn an hour later. He rode home in the cool autumn dark, feeling every mile of the distance between himself and the courage he hadn't managed to find when it mattered. The next 10 days were the worst of it. Not dramatically. There was no confrontation, no scene, nothing that anyone observing from the outside would have marked as significant. The harvest concluded. The weather held. His cattle came through the season in better shape than expected. On paper, October was shaping up to be the strongest month he'd had in 2 years. But he moved through it with the particular low misery of a man who knows exactly what his problem is and is still failing to address it. He'd been close twice now, at the cutting rig, at the barn dance, and both times he'd let the moment close around itself without reaching into it. Each missed chance had a cost. He could see it in the way Eliza was around him now, still kind, still genuine, but with a new quality of reserve, like a window you can see through but can no longer open. He'd done that. He was doing it, and knowing it didn't seem to be enough to stop it. It was Daniel Bennett who said the thing that finally moved him, not intentionally. Daniel was 17 and about as subtle as a dropped fence post, and he'd come over to return a post hole digger he'd borrowed and ended up sitting on Wade's porch steps drinking water and talking about a horse he was trying to train. And somewhere in the middle of a completely unrelated conversation about hoof care, Daniel said, "Eliza's been quiet lately. Dad says she's just tired from the harvest, but I don't think that's it. She gets quiet like that sometimes when something's bothering her and she doesn't want to say." He said it the way 17-year-olds say revealing things, without awareness of the weight of them, as a simple observation, moving on immediately to the next topic. Wade didn't move on. "Does she say what it is?" he asked carefully. Daniel shrugged. "Never. She just gets quiet, and then after a while she's fine again. That's just how Eliza is." He stood up, handed the water cup back, grabbed the post hole digger. "Good horse, by the way, that roan of yours." After Daniel had gone, Wade stood on his porch for a long time. The afternoon was overcast, the light flat and gray, the kind of October day that feels like a held breath. She gets quiet like that when something's bothering her and she doesn't want to say. He thought about her at the barn dance, the hairline crack in the careful surface. He thought about the window that could no longer be opened. He thought about a woman who had been visible and open and present through an entire summer's worth of his confusion and avoidance, who had said, "I know what you were avoiding," without accusation, who had brought coffee to the hayfield and smiled at him from across the creek, and turned down a decent man twice for reasons she had never stated to anyone. He thought about his mother dying when he was 11, and his father folding inward, and the lesson he had absorbed from that, the one he'd built his life around. The price of loving something is the size of the hole it leaves. And he thought, for the first time, in the particular clarity that comes from being tired enough of your own damage, that this was also true in reverse. The size of what you refuse to open yourself to is exactly the size of the hole it leaves anyway. He'd spent 6 years building walls against loss. He'd lost things anyway. He'd lost his father, and Cole's proximity, and the version of his life that might have had more warmth in it. He'd just lost them quietly, without incident, in ways that didn't look like losing because he'd never named what he was turning away from. The fear hadn't protected him from anything. It had just made him smaller. He went inside. He sat at the kitchen table. He opened the top drawer and took out the folded piece of paper with its 4 lines and looked at the last one. I'm tired of being safe. He'd written that 6 weeks ago. He was still tired of it. He closed the drawer. He went out to the barn and saddled his horse. The afternoon light was going gray at the edges, and the temperature was dropping, and he could smell the first real edge of winter on the air, still weeks away but present now, a warning in the cold. He rode toward the Bennett place. He didn't have a speech. He didn't have a plan. He had only the clear, slightly frightening knowledge that he had run out of road on the other direction, and that whatever happened at the end of this ride was going to be more honest than anything he'd managed in the last several months. The Bennett house had its lamps lit. Thomas's wagon was in the yard. Somewhere in the distance, Copper was standing in the paddock beside the barn, and that detail, the brown horse, standing quiet in the gray afternoon, was enough to anchor him. He tied his horse at the fence. He walked up to the door. He knocked. Ruth Bennett answered. She looked at him for a moment with those quick, perceptive eyes. She had flour on her apron. "Wade Mercer," she said, not unkindly. "Mrs. Bennett?" He took his hat off. "I'm looking for Eliza." Ruth looked at him for another moment, the look of a woman assessing whether a thing she has waited a long time for is finally, actually arriving. Then she stepped back from the door. "She's at the creek," she said. "The flat rock." He knew the flat rock. He put his hat back on and walked toward the creek. The creek was running low and quiet in the October cold, barely a sound over the rocks, more presence than noise. Wade heard it before he saw it, that familiar murmur that had marked the boundary of his life for 6 years, and he followed it through the scrubland behind the Bennett property where the cedars grew close together and the light came through them sideways at this hour, thin and gray and going fast. He found her exactly where Ruth had said, the flat rock at the creek's edge. She was sitting with her knees pulled up and her arms around them, not reading this time, just looking at the water. She had a wool shawl around her shoulders against the cold, and her hair was down, and she didn't look up when she heard him coming through the brush, which meant either she hadn't heard him or she had, and was deciding how to receive him. He stepped out of the cedars onto the bank. She looked up then, and whatever she'd been preparing for, whatever arrangement she'd made with herself about how to handle him, he could see it recalibrate in real time when she took in his face, because whatever was on his face right now was apparently different from what she'd been expecting. "Wade," she said, not a greeting, more like a question. He came and stood at the edge of the flat rock. He turned his hat in his hands twice, the way men do when they've run out of things to do with their hands, and then he stopped because it was a nervous habit, and he was done pretending he wasn't nervous. "I owe you an honest conversation," he said. "I've been putting it off, and I'm done putting it off." She looked at him steadily. She didn't make it easier for him by filling the silence. He'd noticed she never did that. She didn't paper over uncomfortable moments with words to relieve the tension. She just sat in them and waited, which was its own kind of courage, and also, right now, its own kind of pressure. "I've been afraid," he said. "That's the plain truth of it. Not of you. Of—" He stopped, started again. "When my mother died, I watched my father go somewhere the rest of us couldn't follow him. He was there in the body for 20 more years and gone everywhere else. I was 11 years old, and I decided I understood what had happened to him, and I was never going to let that happen to me. And I've spent a long time being very careful about that." The creek ran. A cedar branch moved somewhere above them in the cold air. "I'm not telling you this so you'll feel sorry for me," he said. "I'm telling you because you deserve to know why I've been the way I've been around you this whole summer." Eliza had not moved. Her expression was careful but not closed. She was listening the way she listened to everything, fully, without rushing toward the end of it. "I've been watching you," he said, and then immediately heard how that sounded and said, I just mean I've been paying attention this year, and I keep thinking about the fence, about how you showed up and just did the work, and handed me the level and didn't make a production out of any of it, and the book at the creek, and the coffee at the hayfield. He exhaled. The truth is, a man lucky enough to have someone like you beside him for the rest of his life. That's not a small thing. That's everything. And I've known that for a while now, and I've been sitting on it because I was scared of wanting something that much. The silence that followed was long enough that he started to wonder if he'd miscalculated everything, if the careful expression and the reserve he'd read as patience was actually something else entirely, if Abner Whitfield's secondhand information about Caleb Harrington had been wrong, if he'd just made the most embarrassing mistake of his adult life. Then Eliza said, "Do you know how long I've been waiting for you to say something?" Her voice was not gentle. It was honest, which was better. There was something in it that was almost exasperated and almost relieved and entirely real. "I have a fair idea," he said quietly. "I don't think you do." She unfolded herself from the position she'd been sitting in and stood up on the rock so they were roughly eye level, the creek behind her, the gray afternoon light making everything look slightly more significant than usual. "Wade, I've watched you for 2 years. Not this summer, 2 years. I've watched you work yourself to nothing and go home to an empty house and convince yourself that was the right way to live. And I've tried to be available without being obvious about it, because I have some pride and I wasn't going to stand on a fence post and wave." Her voice caught slightly on that last word, not with tears, but with something that had been held under pressure for a long time. "And then this summer you finally started looking. And I thought, finally. And then you'd look, and then you'd leave, and I didn't know if I was imagining it or if you were just being neighborly." "I wasn't being neighborly," he said. "I know that now." She looked at him directly. "But I needed you to know it first." He looked at her standing on that flat rock in the October cold, with the creek behind her and her shawl slipping off one shoulder and her eyes absolutely clear, and he understood with the uncomplicated certainty of something finally landing after a long fall that this was the most real moment he'd had in years. Maybe longer. It wasn't comfortable. It wasn't the resolved, settled feeling he'd imagined a moment like this would have. His heart was hitting his ribs with an enthusiasm that was frankly undignified for a man his age. "I know it," he said. "I know what I want. And it's you." That's not an eloquent thing to say, but it's true. Something in her face changed then. The carefulness of it shifted. Not dissolved. She wasn't the kind of woman who dissolved, and he didn't want her to be, but opened in the way a room changes when you raise the shade on a window. The warmth that he'd been catching glimpses of all summer was suddenly just present, uncovered, right there. "It's a fine thing to say," she said, and then quieter. "I hoped it would be you. I've been hoping it would be you for a long time." He stepped up onto the rock. They were standing close, not touching, the cold air between them carrying the smell of cedar and creek water and autumn, and the moment had the quality of something held very still, not because it was fragile, but because it was real, and real things deserve to be received carefully. He reached out and took her hand, not dramatically, just took it. The way you pick up something you've been looking at for a long time and finally have permission to hold. Her fingers were cold from sitting in the October air, and she didn't pull back. "I've wasted a lot of time," he said. "Yes," she agreed. She was looking at their hands. "But you're here now." "I'm here now," he said. They stood at the creek in the failing afternoon light and didn't say much else, because there wasn't much else that needed saying yet. There would be time for the rest of it. The conversations, the complications, the practical reality of two people deciding to build something together in a place that didn't make anything easy. There would be time for all of that. Right now there was just the creek and the cold and the particular relief of a thing finally named. He did not kiss her. Not that afternoon. He was not a man who moved fast, and she was not a woman who expected him to be. What they had was the beginning of something. Acknowledged, mutual, finally in the open air where it could breathe. And beginnings needed space. He walked her back to the Bennett house in the dusk, and at the porch steps she looked at him with that warm, unguarded expression. He was only now learning he could look at directly without flinching. "You should come for supper Sunday," she said. "I'll come for supper Sunday," he said. She went inside. He rode home in the dark, and the dark felt completely different from every other dark ride home he'd taken this year. He slept, finally, without the restlessness. Thomas Bennett was in the barn when Wade arrived Sunday, working on a piece of harness with the focused attention of a man who has been doing this kind of work for 30 years and still takes it seriously. He looked up when Wade came in, took in his face, and said, "About time," which appeared to be the universal response of everyone in the Bennett family to any development involving Wade Mercer. "I know," Wade said. Thomas set down the harness. He was a square, weathered man with Ruth's same quality of directness and a handshake that had never once failed to be genuine. "You mean to court her properly?" "Yes, sir." "You understand what you're asking," Thomas said. Not as a question, as a man establishing that the terms were clear. "I understand," Wade said. I don't take this lightly. I haven't for a while. I was slow to act on it, and that's on me. But I'm here now, and I intend to be honest about what I want." Thomas studied him for a moment with the unhurried assessment of a man who has known another man for years and is simply confirming what he already knows. Then he held out his hand. Wade shook it. "She's her own person," Thomas said. "She makes her own choices, and she's made them well. I'm not giving you anything. She'd object to the framing, but you have my blessing to try." "That's all I'm asking for," Wade said. Thomas picked up the harness again. "Ruth's got a roast on. Go wash up." Supper was different from every previous meal Wade had eaten at the Bennett table, though from the outside it probably didn't look like much had changed. Thomas told a story about a neighbor's escaped pig that had taken up residence in Mabel Rutherford's kitchen garden. Daniel ate 3 servings of everything and talked about his horse. Ruth kept the breadbasket full, and the conversation moving with the efficient warmth of a woman who has run a household for 25 years. Eliza sat across the table from Wade, and they talked about ordinary things: the season, the late hay harvest, the condition of the county road after the rains, and occasionally their eyes met across the ordinary conversation, and those moments had a particular quiet electricity that was entirely different from the careful management of the previous months. After supper, Thomas and Daniel went out to check on the livestock, as was the habit, and Ruth announced she needed to look at something in the cellar with the transparent invention of a woman manufacturing a reason to be elsewhere. Wade and Eliza sat at the kitchen table with their coffee cups and the lamp burning between them and the house quiet around them. And this, Wade thought, was the thing he'd been building fences against for years. This specific ordinariness, this particular warmth of a kitchen and another person and the leftover smell of a shared meal. It was terrifying and completely right. "My father likes you," Eliza said. "He's known me for 10 years. He liked you before. He likes you differently now." She turned her coffee cup in her hands. "My mother's been praying for this since approximately 2014 in her personal calendar of events. Not that she'd say that." "She doesn't need to," Wade said. Eliza smiled. It was the real one, the one she didn't deploy for general company. "What changed?" she asked. You'd built some very effective walls, Wade. I'm asking genuinely. What made you finally come to the creek?" He thought about it, the paper in the drawer, Cole's letter. Daniel saying she gets quiet when something's bothering her. The accumulated weight of months of missed moments. The ride home from the Rutherford barn in the dark. "I got tired of being correct about everything," he said. "I had all the right reasons for everything I was doing. They were good reasons, but they were adding up to nothing. To a very well-managed nothing." She was quiet for a moment. "I know about that," she said more softly. "Harrington," he said. He hadn't planned to say it. She looked at him. "Caleb is a fine man." "I know. But when he talked to me, it felt like being assessed for a position," she said. "Like he was looking at what I could provide rather than who I am." She paused. "That might be ungenerous. I don't know what was in his head." "That's not ungenerous," Wade said. "That's honest." "The second time he asked, I almost said yes," she admitted. "It was the spring before last, and I was tired of waiting for something that might not be coming. My mother was worried about me. People talk, in a town like this, about a woman who says no too many times." She said it matter-of-factly, without self-pity, but it landed with weight. "I sat with his proposal for 3 days, and in the end, I just couldn't. It didn't feel right. He deserved better than someone settling." Wade set his coffee cup down. "I'm glad you didn't," he said. "I know that's selfish." "It is," she agreed. "But I'm glad too." A beat. Don't make me regret it." "I won't," he said. They sat in the lamplight a while longer, talking about nothing important and everything important the way people do when the big thing between them has finally been laid on the table and they're finding out what else they have to say to each other. They had more than either of them had perhaps expected. She told him about a letter she'd written to a women's land rights organization in the East, about the Bennett property and the Garfield survey dispute, which had never fully been resolved in legal terms even if the Garfields had backed down practically. He told her about the bank situation with the Ridge acreage, which he had not told anyone, not even Thomas, because he'd been managing it alone the way he managed everything alone. She listened without interrupting, and when he'd finished, she asked 2 questions that went directly to the practical core of the problem. And her second question pointed at a solution, a refinancing approach tied to grazing lease revenue that he hadn't considered. "You should talk to Orson Graves about the lease structure," she said. "I have an appointment with him Wednesday," Wade said. "Bring the survey maps." "I was going to." "Bring the older ones too," she said. "The ones from your grandfather's time. They show the original creek boundary, and that matters for the eastern lease calculation." He looked at her across the table. She was looking back at him with that direct, unself-conscious intelligence that had been visible to everyone in the valley for years, and that he had, somehow, been looking past. "You figured that out fast," he said. "I've been paying attention to your property for a long time," she said. And then, aware of how that sounded, she added with dry practicality, "Neighboring ranches affect each other. It's sensible to pay attention." "That's one way to put it," he said. The color that came into her face was slight but genuine, and he found it devastating in a way he was wholly unprepared for. The courting that followed over the next 6 weeks was, by Blackstone Ridge standards, both the most and least surprising thing that had happened in recent memory. Least surprising because the whole valley had apparently been waiting for it for the better part of 2 years, and now that it was happening, everyone simply nodded and said, "Well, yes, obviously," in the way of communities that believe themselves to have been correct about something all along. Most surprising because Wade Mercer, who had conducted the previous decade of his life with the social visibility of a fence post, was suddenly, voluntarily, regularly present at the Bennett property and occasionally seen walking with Eliza Bennett in town. And this required some adjustment on the part of people who had long since categorized him as a permanent solitary. He was not comfortable with the visibility. He'd have been lying if he said otherwise. The first time he walked with her from Caldwell's Dry Goods to the Bennett wagon and registered the interested attention of 3 separate people he knew, he felt the very specific discomfort of a private man in a public moment, his skin slightly too small. Eliza noticed. She was walking beside him, and she said quietly without looking at him, "You look like a man who's considering a tactical retreat." "I'm fine," he said. "You're not." A pause. "You don't have to be comfortable with it. Just don't run." "I'm not going to run," he said. "Good." She shifted the package she was carrying from one arm to the other. "Because Mabel Rutherford is watching us from the post office window, and if you look uncertain, it'll be all over the valley by Thursday." He almost laughed. "You're aware of exactly how much everyone pays attention." "I grew up here," she said. "I've never had the luxury of not being aware of it." That was the thing about her, he was learning, that he'd known in outline and was now learning in detail. She had always existed in a world that watched her and formed opinions, and she had navigated that with a practical, unsentimental clarity that he found quietly remarkable. She had never pretended the valley's attention didn't exist. She had just refused to let it make her choices. He straightened up and kept walking and did not look uncertain. Mabel Rutherford could do her worst. The first time he kissed her was 3 weeks into the formal courtship, on the porch of the Bennett house after supper, with the temperature near freezing and their breath visible in the November air. It was not particularly smooth. He'd been building toward it for 10 minutes in an increasingly obvious way, and she had finally turned to look at him with that barely contained patience and said, "Wade." "I know," he said. Then he kissed her. It was brief and clumsy and genuine, and she kissed him back with a warmth that made his chest ache in a way he was beginning to understand was not going to go away, and that he was, for the first time, not interested in protecting himself from. When they separated, she looked at him with her eyes slightly bright. "Took long enough," she said. "I'm aware," he said. She laughed. Real laughter, full and unguarded, and he thought, This is what I've been building fences against." And he felt, Not for the first time and not for the last. The particular quality of foolishness that comes from understanding what you nearly threw away. The November air was cold around them, and the Bennett house was warm behind her, and in the distance somewhere a coyote was calling across the dark valley. And Wade Mercer stood on a porch he'd walked up to for the first time, with his hat in his hands asking for this woman. And he thought he had never in his life felt less certain of anything and more sure at the same time. That contradiction, he was beginning to understand, was not a problem to be solved. It was just what it felt like to be alive in a way he hadn't allowed himself to be in a very long time. Winter came to Blackstone Ridge the way it always did. Without apology, without warning, and about 2 weeks earlier than anyone was prepared for. The first hard freeze arrived on a Tuesday night in late November, and by Wednesday morning Wade was out before dawn breaking ice in the water troughs and checking on the cattle in the north pasture, working through the cold with the mechanical efficiency of a man who has done this enough times that his body knows what to do before his mind has fully caught up. His breath came out in clouds. The ground was iron hard underfoot. The sky was the particular deep blue of a winter morning before the sun has cleared the ridge, and somewhere in the east field one of the younger steers was making the specific kind of low complaint that meant the water situation needed addressing immediately. He was in the middle of all this cold and urgency and frozen horse blankets, quietly content in a way he did not yet know how to account for. That was the winter's most disorienting development. Not the early freeze, not the ice in the pipes that he discovered on Thursday morning and spent 4 hours dealing with. Not the hay supply situation that needed recalculation based on the extended cold forecast. Those were all familiar problems with familiar solutions. The disorienting thing was that somewhere between the Bennett porch in November and the frozen water troughs in December, Wade Mercer had become a man who woke up in the morning with something to look forward to, and this felt so foreign to his established way of operating that he kept noticing it the way you notice a sound in a house that you can't immediately identify. Present, persistent, not unpleasant, just unfamiliar. He and Eliza had a standing arrangement now. Sunday suppers at the Bennetts, which had been the original invitation, had expanded organically to include Wednesday evenings when he rode over after his work was done and sat in the Bennett kitchen while she worked on the household accounts or her ongoing correspondence with the land rights organization in the East. And they talked or didn't talk, and he read through his own paperwork at the same table. And the domestic ordinariness of it was something he had no previous experience with and found himself reaching toward the way a cold man reaches toward a fire. Not dramatic about it, just compelled. She came to the Mercer Ranch for the first time on a Saturday in December, ostensibly to look at the irrigation channel plans for the spring, which was a real errand, but also clearly an errand they had both understood as something more. She walked through his house with the careful attention of someone trying to understand a person through their spaces, which was fair because that was exactly what she was doing. The house was clean but spare, not the spareness of poverty, the spareness of a man who had never seen the point of accumulating things, who had 3 chairs at the kitchen table because that was how many came with the house, and he'd never added a 4th. "You could use curtains," she said, looking at the front window. "I know." "Do they bother you, the bare windows?" He considered it. "No." "Then you've just never thought about it," she said. Not as criticism, just as observation. She was standing in the middle of his kitchen with her coat still on and her hands in her pockets, looking at the space with the same evaluating attention she turned on fence lines and irrigation plans. "It's a good house," she said. "Good bones. The kitchen needs better light in the afternoon. There's a window on the south side. It's too small." She walked to it and looked out at the yard. "If you move the woodpile 3 feet to the left, you'd get another hour of light in here." He looked at where the woodpile was. He had stacked it in that spot for 6 years because his father had stacked it in that spot, and he had never once questioned it. "I'll move it," he said. She turned from the window and looked at him with a half smile. "You don't have to do everything I suggest." "I know," he said. "The woodpile is a good call." She looked around the kitchen one more time. The bare walls, the 3 chairs, the window too small on the south side. And he could see her thinking, not in an acquisitive way, not in the way of someone planning a takeover, in the way of someone beginning to imagine themselves in a space, beginning to think about what it could be. He felt, watching her do this, a complicated mix of vulnerability and wanting that he was only now, at 34, learning to let himself feel without immediately building a wall around it. "Come look at the irrigation plans," he said. They spread the maps on the kitchen table and spent 2 hours on the Spring Channel project, which was a real problem requiring real solutions, and they worked through it the way they worked through everything, with focused, unsentimentally practical attention, occasionally disagreeing, occasionally surprising each other with an angle the other hadn't considered. She had a different relationship with the land than he did, less about defending it, more about understanding it. And the combination of their approaches produced solutions that were better than what either would have arrived at alone. This kept happening, and it kept surprising him. He had expected, in the portion of his mind that had been quietly planning this future, that loving someone would mean adding warmth to his life. He had not quite expected it to mean sharpening him. But she did that. She asked questions that cut through his habitual assumptions. She pushed back when his solutions were too defensive, too focused on protection rather than possibility. And he returned the favor, grounding her longer visions in the practical constraints of seasons and budgets and the specific stubbornness of red clay soil. "We should run the East Channel a different way," she said, tracing a line on the survey map. "Here, along the natural grade. It's longer, but you'd lose less to evaporation. It crosses into the corner of the Bennett property," he said. She looked up. "My father wouldn't object." "I know, but it should be formal, easement on paper." She held his gaze for a moment and then nodded slowly. "You're right. Paper matters." "Paper always matters," he said. "I learned that from your letter to the land rights organization." She smiled at that, genuinely pleased, and the smile went somewhere in him that he was going to have to figure out how to live with for the rest of his life. He asked her to marry him in January. The month leading up to it was, in retrospect, the most transparently obvious series of events in the history of Blackstone Ridge. And he would later be informed by Eliza, with the particular satisfaction of a woman who had been paying attention, that Ruth Bennett had known it was coming before Wade had entirely committed to it himself, which he found both mortifying and unsurprising. He went to Thomas first, on a Thursday evening, because Thomas deserved that and because the formality of it mattered to Wade in a way he wouldn't have expected before this year. He'd come to understand, in the months of Sunday suppers and barn repairs and irrigation plans, what the Bennett family was, not just individually, but as a unit, the specific architecture of how they held each other up, the way Ruth and Thomas had built something over 25 years that had given Eliza the foundation she stood on. He respected that. He intended to honor it. Thomas was in his office when Wade came in, a small room off the main hall stacked with seed catalogs and land records, and a desk that had seen 30 years of farming decisions. He looked up from a ledger and read Wade's face with the immediate comprehension of a man who had been expecting this visit. "Sit down," he said. Wade sat. "I want to marry Eliza," Wade said. He had not planned an elaborate speech, and he didn't give one. "I love her. I've been slow about saying it and slow about everything, and I know that. But I'm certain. I'm more certain of this than I've been of anything." Thomas set down his pen. He leaned back in his chair and looked at Wade for a long moment, not unkindly, but thoroughly, the look of a man tallying an account. "You hurt her feelings this summer," Thomas said. "Not badly. She didn't say so. But I know my daughter." "I know," Wade said. "I did. I was managing my own fear badly at her expense, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise." "She forgave you for it." "She's more generous than I deserve." "Yes," Thomas said, without any intention to soften it. Then, quieter. "That's usually how it works." He picked up his pen again, turned it in his fingers. "I've watched you for 10 years, Wade. You're a stubborn man and a careful one, and you don't open yourself to much. But when you do something, you mean it all the way through." He set the pen down again. "You'll be good to her." It wasn't a question. "I'll spend the rest of my life trying to deserve her," Wade said. "That's the best promise I can make." Thomas was quiet for a moment. Through the wall they could hear Ruth in the kitchen and the sound of Daniel arguing good-naturedly with someone, probably himself, given his habit of conducting ongoing debates with absent opponents. "You have my blessing," Thomas said. "You had it before you walked in here." He said it the same way Ruth had smiled at Wade on the county road in September, as a thing that had been waiting, with considerable patience, to be received. He went back out to the main hall, and Ruth was standing in the kitchen doorway with her apron on and her arms crossed, and an expression that suggested she had been informed of this conversation's content approximately 3 seconds after it was arranged. "She's reading in the front room," Ruth said. "Thomas, you tell him." "He knows," Thomas said from behind the office door. Ruth looked at Wade. "She doesn't know you're coming tonight," she said. "I want you to know that. She doesn't know." "I know," Wade said. Ruth looked at him for a moment more, in that way she had of seeing things clearly, and then she nodded once and went back to the kitchen. He walked to the front room. Eliza was in the chair by the lamp with the thick, battered book. A different one from the creek, he thought, or maybe the same one. He couldn't tell. And she looked up when he came in with the mild, warm attention of someone not expecting anything particular, just glad of the company. She read his face the way she read everything. In about 3 seconds, she put the book down. "Wade," she said, and then nothing else, because she was waiting, and this time the waiting had a different quality. Not the careful management of uncertainty, but the held breath of someone already most of the way certain, needing only the words. He crossed the room. He did not kneel. He was not a man given to grand theatrical gestures, and she would not have wanted that from him anyway. He stood in front of her chair and took her hands, which were warm from the lamp's heat. "I want you to be my wife," he said. "I want to build something with you, not just the ranch, something larger. A life that's worth the work it costs. I've been alone a long time, and I convinced myself that was the smart way to do things, and I was wrong, and you showed me I was wrong, and I'm asking you not to let me go back to it." He stopped. His throat was tight in a way he hadn't anticipated. "I love you." "I should have said that first." Her hands tightened around his. "Yes," she said, simple and immediate and certain. No hesitation, no performance. Just the single honest word of a woman who had made up her mind a long time ago and was glad to finally be asked. He let out a breath he had been holding for months. She reached up and put her hand against his jaw, which was rough because he had not shaved today, and she looked at him with the unguarded warmth that he had spent an entire summer being afraid to see directed at him, and he let himself receive it without flinching. "I love you too," she said, in case that was in question. "It was, a little," he admitted. "I know." She dropped her hand and looked at him with that familiar edge of dry humor. "You are not the most perceptive reader of available information." "I've been informed. Multiple times, I imagine." "Abner Whitfield, your mother, your brother, accidentally. My own brother in a letter." She laughed. "Cole wrote to you about me?" "Not exactly. He wrote about himself, and I read it as being about me, which is apparently how advice works." She was still smiling. Outside the window, the January dark was complete and cold, the kind of cold that made the house feel more itself, warm and solid and sufficient. And in the front room, the lamp threw a circle of light around the two of them that felt, in the way of moments you know, even as they happen you will remember, entirely complete. The engagement transformed the Bennett household and, by extension, a good portion of Blackstone Ridge, in the way of a thing everyone has been quietly anticipating that lands with more joy than even the anticipation suggested. Ruth cried, which she did efficiently and without drama, and then composed herself and started making plans with an organizational focus that reminded Wade strongly of the way Eliza had appeared at the fence line in July, with better wire than he'd brought. Thomas shook his hand again, which was not something Thomas Bennett did twice, but apparently this warranted it. Daniel said, "Finally, this is embarrassing for everyone," and was told firmly by his mother to eat his supper. Cole wrote back from Denver with a letter that was 3 pages long and mostly variations on "I knew it," interspersed with genuine warmth and an announcement that he and Margaret, the Denver widow, intended to come out for the wedding if the railroad schedule allowed, which it ultimately would. The Valley reacted with the particular communal satisfaction of a community that believes it has been right about something for long enough to have earned the outcome. Mabel Rutherford organized a supper in their honor before anyone had asked her to, which was characteristic. The Whitfield brothers, both of them, which was rare, came over to shake Wade's hand with expressions suggesting they had won a long-standing bet, which he suspected was literally true. Caleb Harrington heard the news on a Wednesday and sought Wade out the following Friday at the Dusty Lantern, which was either the bravest or the most decent thing Wade had seen a man do in a while. He shook Wade's hand and said, without apparent bitterness, "She's a remarkable woman. You take care of her right." I intend to, Wade said. Harrington nodded and ordered a beer and went to sit with some other men. And that was that, handled with a cleanness that Wade found himself respecting more than he'd expected to. He and Eliza spent the winter months planning in the particular way of two people who are good at planning, practically, without sentimentality about the work it would require. They agreed to combine the management of both properties after the wedding, which was a decision that made financial sense and also made sense in the deeper way of two people who had spent the previous decade doing the same kind of work separately and could see clearly the advantages of doing it together. They walked the fence lines in the cold, talking through what needed repair before spring. They sat with the maps and the account books and made projections that were honest about the difficulties and realistic about the opportunities. The irrigation channel project became the first thing they tackled as an officially engaged couple, which they both recognized as appropriately characteristic. They broke ground in February on a cold, gray morning with the creek frozen in its shallower reaches and their breath coming out in matching clouds. And they worked side by side in the dirt the way they'd worked side by side at the fence the previous July. Easy and efficient and without friction, handing each other tools before being asked. "You know this is not what most people do when they're engaged," Eliza said at one point, knee-deep in a trench, her hair escaping from under her hat. "You want to do something else?" he asked. She looked at him. "No," she said. "I just meant most people have a different idea of romance." "Is this not romantic?" he said, gesturing at the frozen trench. She looked at the trench. She looked at him. "Oddly," she said. "Yes." He laughed, and she laughed. And somewhere in the cold February air over the Bennett-Mercer Creek line, the sound of it carried further than either of them expected. But the winter was not without its hard edges. Nothing in Blackstone Ridge ever was. In February, 3 weeks after they broke ground on the irrigation channel, the worst blizzard in 5 years hit the valley. It came in fast on a Thursday evening, and by Friday morning had deposited 18 inches of snow across the ridge, drifted to 4 feet along the north face of both properties, and dropped the temperature far enough overnight that Wade lost 2 young steers that hadn't been in the shelter barn when the weather turned. He spent Friday and most of Saturday dealing with the aftermath: livestock check, equipment dig-out, the collapsed section of roof on the equipment shed that needed temporary repair before the next snowfall came. He worked through it grimly and without complaint, the way he'd always handled disaster, and by Saturday evening he had it managed, not resolved but stable, the way you get most disasters to stable before you can get them to resolved. He rode to the Bennetts to check on their situation in the late afternoon, half snow and half ice pelting the side of his face, and found Eliza already out in the yard dealing with a blocked drainage channel that was threatening to push snowmelt toward the lower barn. He helped her clear it without discussion, the two of them working in the miserable cold with the particular efficiency of people who have run out of the luxury of doing things carefully. When it was done, they stood in the yard, muddy and wet and cold, and she said, "You lost cattle." "2 steers," he said, "young ones. I should have gotten them in Thursday, but I thought the weather would hold." She looked at him, not with pity, not with the false comfort of someone trying to minimize a real loss, just with the direct acknowledgement of someone who understands what it costs. "That's a hard thing," she said. "Yes," he said. She put her hand on his arm briefly through his coat. It was a small gesture and not a grand one, and it was exactly right. He had grown up in a world where loss was managed by pushing it down and moving on, where the protocol was to absorb and continue, and she was offering him something different, not rescue from the loss, just company in it. Just the acknowledgement that it was real. He'd never had that before. He found that it helped more than he would have predicted. They went inside and Ruth made something hot, and they sat at the kitchen table with the blizzard still going outside and Thomas and Daniel coming in from the barn stamping snow, and the Bennett kitchen was warm and loud and ordinary and imperfect and exactly the thing Wade had built walls against for years. He sat in the middle of it and felt, through the tiredness and the grief of 2 lost steers and 3 days of hard weather, profoundly, stubbornly glad. He had a meeting with Orson Graves at the bank in early March to formalize the financial structure of the combined operation. The merged management approach they'd agreed on required some careful accounting work to handle the property boundaries and the shared expenses properly. Eliza came with him, which surprised Orson slightly, which in turn said something about Orson's assumptions that Wade filed away without comment. What did not surprise Orson, or anyone else by that point, was that she arrived with the survey maps, both old and new, and the lease revenue figures and the irrigation channel projections, and a set of questions that went to the center of the refinancing problem with a precision that made Orson reach for his own notes and refer to them rather than working from memory. "The eastern lease structure," she said, spreading the older survey map on Orson's desk. "If you look at the original creek boundary here, Bus, this affects your acreage calculation for the collateral assessment." Orson looked at the map. He looked at Wade. "She's right," he said. "I know," Wade said. The refinancing came through on better terms than Wade had dared to project, and he walked out of the bank into the March sunlight with Eliza beside him, and the financial ground of the next decade considerably more solid than it had been going in. And he thought about the list he'd made at his kitchen table in August. 4 lines in a ledger, the last one reading, "I'm tired of being safe," and thought that safe and solid were not the same thing, and that he had spent 6 years confusing the two. She was looking at him from under the brim of her hat. "You're thinking something," she said. "Thinking we made a good argument in there," he said. "We did," she agreed. Then, "You were going to try to do that alone." "I was," he said, "and you would have gotten a worse deal." "Almost certainly," he said. She looked at him with the expression he was learning to read as affection expressed through the vehicle of being entirely right about something. "Good thing you went to the creek that day," she said. "Best thing I ever did," he said. She held his gaze for a moment, and the thing between them had no self-consciousness in it anymore. No management, no careful surface. Just two people who had found their way to each other through a summer of fence repairs and missed moments and one honest conversation at the water's edge, standing in March sunlight on the main street of a town that had been watching them both for years and was now, with considerable satisfaction, watching what came next. He offered her his arm. She took it. They walked to the wagon together and the town watched, and Wade did not once feel the urge to retreat. The wedding was set for the second Saturday of May, which gave the valley exactly enough time to finish its spring planning and work itself into a state of collective anticipation that Wade found both touching and mildly overwhelming. He had not anticipated, when he walked to the creek that October evening, that saying an honest thing to one person would eventually result in what appeared to be the entire population of Blackstone Ridge having opinions about flower arrangements. But here they were. Ruth Bennett had taken charge of the planning with the same quiet organizational efficiency she applied to everything, which meant it was handled well and without drama, and the handful of decisions that were genuinely Wade and Eliza's to make, where the ceremony would be, who would speak, what the day should feel like, she left entirely to them, which he respected. Eliza handled the rest with her characteristic directness, making decisions without agonizing over them, saying no to suggestions she didn't want without elaborate apology, accepting help where it was offered genuinely, and redirecting it where it wasn't useful. She wanted the ceremony outside. That was the first thing she'd said when they talked about it, sitting at the kitchen table in March with the bank meeting still fresh and the spring mud beginning outside the window. "Outside," she said. "I've spent my whole life in this valley. I want to get married in it, not in a building." "Where outside?" he asked. She looked at him. He already knew the answer. The creek. The flat rock, specifically, or near enough to it. A stretch of the bank where the old cottonwoods grew wide and the water ran clear over smooth stones, and the ridge was visible to the west, catching the afternoon light. It was on the boundary between the two properties, technically, which seemed right. It had always been the boundary between them, the place where their lives touched, where he'd watched her read, where they'd stood in the October cold and finally said what needed saying. He said, "The cottonwoods." She said, "Yes." That was the whole conversation. They moved on to other things. Cole arrived from Denver on a Thursday, 2 days before the wedding, with Margaret, the Denver widow, and her 2 boys, who were 9 and 11, and had the collectively destructive energy of a small natural disaster. He came off the stage looking better than the last time Wade had seen him, steadier, less scattered. The particular restlessness that had always characterized him settled into something more purposeful. Margaret was a compact, direct woman with gray-streaked hair and an evaluating gaze that reminded Wade, not unpleasantly, of Eliza's, and she shook his hand with a grip that told him she had formed her own opinions and would stand by them. "She's good," Cole said to Wade. while the boys were being introduced to the Bennett horses and trying to climb things they'd been specifically asked not to climb. He meant Margaret. "I can see that," Wade said. "Better than I deserve," Cole said. "Runs in the family," Wade said. Cole looked at him. A long look, the kind that traveled the distance between 11 and 34, between a boy watching his father fold inward and a man standing in a spring field 2 days before his wedding. And then he put his arm around Wade's shoulders briefly, the way brothers do when they have too much to say and too little practice saying it. "Dad would have liked her," Cole said quietly. "Eliza. He would have liked her a lot." Wade nodded. He didn't trust himself to say much, so he didn't say much. But he stayed near his brother for a while in the afternoon sun, and it was enough. The morning of the wedding arrived gray and slightly cold, which was the kind of weather that makes a person reconsider the decision to hold an outdoor ceremony in May in a valley where the mountains made their own weather. Wade stood on his porch at 6 in the morning, looking at the sky with the assessment of a man who has spent his entire life reading weather and concluded that it would clear by midday. He was right, barely. The clouds broke around 11 and the sky came through in the particular vivid blue of spring at altitude, the kind of blue that looks painted. The cottonwoods along the creek were in new leaf, pale and bright green, and the water was running well with the snowmelt, and the sound of it filled the air with a clean, continuous presence that made the whole setting feel less like a ceremony and more like something the land itself was participating in. The whole valley came. That was not an exaggeration. The whole valley came. Ranching families, townspeople, the older women who had known Wade's father and Eliza's grandparents, the younger families who had been helped through hard seasons by one or both of the people getting married today. They gathered along the creek bank in their best clothes with the easy sociability of people who spend most of their time working hard and take their celebrations seriously. Wade stood at the water's edge under the cottonwoods and waited, and he was nervous in a way that was entirely undignified for a man who had faced droughts and debt and blizzards without visible distress, and he was aware of this and did not care. He heard her before he saw her. He heard the shift in the crowd, the collective held breath of 100 people simultaneously turning to look at the same thing, and then he saw her coming through the cottonwoods on her father's arm. She was wearing a dress the color of cream, not elaborate. Eliza was not an elaborate woman, but fitted to her properly and with a quality of intention in it, and her hair was up in a way it wasn't usually, and she was carrying wild flowers she'd picked herself that morning because she had told Ruth that she was not carrying flowers she hadn't put her own hands on. She looked, in the way of people who look most like themselves on significant occasions, entirely and completely like Eliza. She saw him in the careful public composure she was maintaining cracked, just slightly, into a smile that was meant specifically for him and not for the general audience, and he felt it the same way he'd been feeling her since October, directly, in the center of the chest, with no remaining capacity to pretend it was something manageable. Thomas placed her hand in Wade's and stepped back and said quietly, so that only they could hear it, "Take care of each other." "We will," Eliza said, before Wade could. Wade said it too, a beat behind, and meant it the same. The man who performed the ceremony was Judge Aldrich from the county seat, a dry, thoughtful man of 60-something who had married half the valley over his tenure and had a gift for saying necessary things without ornament. He kept it short, because short was what they'd asked for, and what he said was honest, and without the kind of inflated language that makes people feel like they're in a performance rather than a moment. When the judge got to the vows, Wade had written his own, which Eliza had not known, and the surprise of it, brief, visible, was the most genuinely moved he'd ever seen her look in public. He said, "I spent a long time building walls and calling it wisdom. You showed me the difference between being protected and being closed, and you were patient with me longer than I deserved. I'm going to spend the rest of my life being honest with you, working beside you, and making sure you never have to be as patient as you were this past year." He paused. "And I'm going to move the woodpile." There was a ripple of laughter through the assembled crowd, because enough people had heard the woodpile story by now to know what it meant. And Eliza laughed too, the real one, the full one, and her eyes were bright. "I love you," he said. "That's the plain truth of all of it." She composed herself. She had written her own vows too, which he had not known either, and what she said was characteristic of her. Direct, unsentimentally honest, with enough warmth in it that he felt the people around them go quiet in a listening way. She said, You are a harder man to reach than most people would have bothered with. I bothered with you because I could see what you were protecting under all that careful distance, and it was worth the wait. I want to work beside you, argue with you, and fix things with you for the rest of my life. I want to hand you the level when you need it and expect you to hand it back. I love you, Wade Mercer. I have for a long time. He kissed her. The valley approved. The celebration that followed was the kind that comes naturally to people who know how to work and have finally been given permission to stop for a day. Food appeared from everywhere. Ruth's roast and Mabel Rutherford's pie, and the Whitfield brothers contributed barrel of something that was technically cider and practically stronger. The fiddle player from the Harvest Social came back, and dancing started before the afternoon was half done. Cole danced with Margaret and looked 17 years younger. Daniel danced with every girl under 20 in Blackstone Ridge and was politely declined by most of them and took it in stride. Thomas Bennett stood at the edge of the gathering with a cup in his hand and watched his daughter with an expression that was simply, quietly proud. Wade danced once, badly, because he was not a man who had danced much, and Eliza danced with him and laughed at how bad it was. And he laughed too, and they lasted through most of a reel before retreating to the edge of the gathering where it was slightly quieter. They stood together at the creek's edge, the flat rock just visible downstream, the cottonwoods moving overhead in the afternoon light. And the party carried on around them, and neither of them needed to say much. "You wrote vows," she said. "You did too," he said. "I did." She was looking at the water. The woodpile thing was very effective. Half the women in the valley wept. "I meant it," he said. "I know you did. That's why they wept." He put his arm around her, and she leaned into him in the easy way of someone who has decided where they belong and is done deliberating about it. And they stood at the creek they'd been meeting at for a year, in one way or another, and let the afternoon happen around them. The years that followed did not proceed smoothly, because nothing in Blackstone Ridge ever did. The summer after the wedding brought a real drought. Not the mild, dry spell of the previous year, but the genuine, hard, sustained kind that cracked the earth in the lower pastures and took the creek down to its lowest level in a decade. They lost the east hay crop almost entirely. Wade spent 3 months making decisions about water allocation that felt like choosing between bad options and worse ones, and more than once he sat at the kitchen table at midnight with the account books and the choices they described, and felt the old contraction of dread that had been the central weather of his interior life for years. The difference was that Eliza sat across the table from him, not solving everything, not making it easy, but present, working the same problem, her handwriting in the margins of the same pages. And when the decisions were made, she stood behind them without second-guessing, and when the losses came, she acknowledged them without pretending they didn't hurt. And when he was at his most grim, she didn't paper over it with false optimism, but she also didn't let him disappear into it. "We lost the East crop," she said one evening in August, after they'd done the final accounting on the season. Flat statement of fact. "Yes," he said, "we still have the North hay, we have the cattle, we have the grazing lease revenue from the ridge." "I know. The channel we built in February performed," she said. "We're not as bad as the Whitfields." "The Whitfields are bad," he said, "which is exactly my point." She closed the account book. "We're going to be fine. Not comfortable, but fine. There's a difference." He looked at her across the table in the lamplight, this woman who had handed him a level at a flooded fence line, and waited with more patience than he deserved, and said yes without hesitation on a January evening in her father's front room, and he thought, she has never once pretended anything is easier than it is. She has never offered him comfort that wasn't grounded in something real. Every reassurance she'd ever given him had been honest enough to hold weight. He trusted her assessments the way he trusted survey maps and water tables, because they were made from observation, not wishfulness. "We're fine," he said. "Yes," she said, "we are." They were. The Garfield property dispute, which Eliza had been working on in correspondence for over a year before the wedding, was formally resolved in their favor the following spring. Not the Bennetts' favor specifically, but the county's formal acknowledgement of the original survey boundary, which mattered to every small ranching family along that creek line. Eliza had done most of the legal groundwork herself, through the Land Rights Organization and a sympathetic county surveyor she'd cultivated over 18 months of careful correspondence. And when the decision came through, Thomas Bennett read the letter twice, and then looked at his daughter with an expression that suggested there were no words adequate to the occasion. Wade watched from the kitchen doorway while Thomas read it, and when Thomas looked up and found him standing there, Wade said, "She's been working on that for 2 years." "I know," Thomas said. "I just never thought she'd—" "I did," Wade said, simple and sure. That was the thing about watching Eliza work over years rather than months. The scale of what she was capable of became visible in a different way. Not in sudden moments of brilliance, which she was also capable of, but in the sustained, patient, strategic way she moved toward things that mattered. She was not in a hurry when hurrying wasn't useful, and she was absolutely relentless when it was. Wade had learned to tell the difference, and he had learned that his job was sometimes to support the patients and sometimes to supply the urgency she needed from outside herself, and that she did the same for him in reverse, slowing his defensive contractions, pushing his longer vision. They had built a working partnership, not a perfect one. There were arguments, real ones, not the kind that dissolve after 10 minutes, the kind that require sleeping on them and coming back the next day. They argued about the South Pasture rotation and about the terms of the lease renewal, and once, memorably, about whether to help the Hanley family financially through a bad season, which Wade's instinct said was beyond their means and Eliza's said was necessary on grounds that went beyond accounting. She was right about the Hanleys. He acknowledged it. She was right about the South Pasture, too, which took slightly longer to acknowledge, but he got there. She was wrong about the lease renewal terms, and he had the numbers to prove it, and she sat with his argument for 2 days before coming back and saying, "You're right, I didn't weight the risk correctly." Said it directly, without the kind of face-saving that makes people useless to argue with. He valued that more than he could adequately express, that she was capable of being wrong in front of him without it costing her something she couldn't afford. It made the whole enterprise, the ranch, the marriage, the long work of building something together, feel solid in a way he'd never managed alone. 3 years after the wedding, they had a daughter. She was born in March, which was bad timing in terms of the calving season and good timing in terms of what that particular March needed, which was something worth stopping work for. Ruth was there for the birth, and Thomas paced outside the bedroom door with the suppressed anxiety of a man who has done this before and knows it doesn't get easier to watch. Cole sent a letter from Denver that arrived 2 weeks late and was mostly capital letters and exclamation points, which was unlike him, and therefore more moving than his more eloquent letters. Wade held his daughter for the first time, and she was red-faced and furious about existing, and roughly the size of a feed bag, and she looked at him with the dark, unfocused gaze of something entirely new and entirely defenseless, and he understood. In the physical way you understand things you've only ever understood intellectually before, what his father had lost when his mother died. He understood it, and he did not fold inward. He looked at Eliza in the bed, exhausted and pale, and watching him with the expression of someone who has just done something very hard and is not going to make a speech about it, and he said, "She's remarkable." "She's screaming," Eliza said. "Still remarkable," he said. Eliza laughed tiredly and held out her arms, and he placed the baby back carefully, with the excessive caution of a man handling something more valuable than anything he's handled before. They named her Clara, after the roan mare, Eliza's suggestion, delivered with the particular humor she saved for ideas she thought were both right and slightly absurd. And he'd said yes immediately because it was right, and because the roan had been the first problem on the morning that turned into the morning he started truly paying attention. Clara was a difficult baby and a stubborn toddler, and showed early signs of being constitutionally incapable of leaving any mechanical or structural problem unexamined, which she appeared to have inherited equally from both parents. Standing at the creek one late afternoon, 6 years after the wedding, with Clara asleep on a blanket nearby and the valley spread out in the evening light, the way it always had been, Wade thought about the man he'd been when he first started really looking at Eliza. 34, alone, functional, careful, proud of his self-sufficiency in the way of someone who has made a virtue of a limitation. He had thought the fence he'd built around himself was protection. He had been wrong about that. It was just a smaller life. Eliza sat down beside him on the bank, close enough that their shoulders touched. She had mud on her boots from the irrigation channel inspection they'd done that afternoon, and she looked tired in the comfortable way of someone at the end of a day that was worth the effort. "What are you thinking?" she said. He didn't answer immediately. He looked at the creek, at the flat rock 10 yards downstream, where they'd had the conversation that changed everything, at the cottonwoods moving in the evening air, at Clara's small chest rising and falling on the blanket. "I'm thinking about what it cost me to be afraid," he said. "All those years, what it actually cost." She was quiet for a moment, not filling the silence the way she never filled silences unnecessarily. And I think I've been paying that debt for 6 years, he said. Not as penance, just building what I should have started building earlier. The thing is, he stopped, tried to get it right. The thing is, I thought the fear was keeping me from losing things, but it was just making sure I never had anything worth losing. She didn't offer him a reassuring counter to that. She heard it straight, which was what he needed. "You got here," she said finally. "Barely. Barely counts," she said. "In ranching and in everything else, barely is fine. You got to the water before the cattle died. That's the whole job." He looked at her. The evening light was doing what it did in this valley, going gold and long across the scrubland, making everything look slightly more permanent than it was. She was not looking at him with the expression of a woman offering wisdom. She was looking at the creek with her boots muddy and her hair escaping its pins and her shoulder warm against his, entirely ordinary and entirely essential. And he thought, this is the thing I almost didn't have the courage to reach for. He thought about his father and the lesson he'd taken from watching him. The price of loving something is the size of the hole it leaves. He had carried that lesson for 23 years like a debt he owed the dead. But his father had loved his mother and lost her and been broken by it. And the real lesson in that, the one he'd taken so long to find, was not don't love. It was love anyway, because the hole was there either way. You didn't protect yourself from loss by refusing to love. You just ensured that when the loss came, as it always came, there was nothing to show for the years before it. He had 6 years to show for. A daughter asleep on a blanket. A woman beside him who had handed him a level and waited and finally walked to a flat rock in October and told him she'd been hoping for a long time. A ranch that was stronger than it had been, a community that was better for what they'd built in it, an account book that told a story of 2 people working the same problem from the same side of the table. He had Cole back in some meaningful way. The distance between them narrowed by letters and visits, and the simple fact of being adults who had stopped pretending they didn't need each other. He had the creek, which had always been there, running its own course through the dark, regardless of what the men on either bank decided about their lives. None of it was what he had imagined a good life looking like, back when he was 34 and careful and alone. It was harder and louder and more uncertain. It was full of things that could be lost. Clara got sick in her second winter, and they had 3 days of real fear before she turned the corner. The south pasture flooded 2 years running, and they lost money they'd planned on keeping. There were nights when the account book said things he didn't want to hear, and mornings when the work felt like pushing uphill with no top in sight. But there was also this, a woman beside him, who told him the truth, who built things alongside him rather than watching him build, who laughed at him when he was wrong and backed him when he was right, and held their shared life with the same grip she held everything, firm, honest, unafraid of the weight. That was what he'd been building fences against. Not loss. This. He had almost let the fear of the first cost him the second, and he would carry the knowledge of how close he'd come to that for the rest of his life. Not as a wound, but as a reminder. That you can be so focused on protecting yourself from the worst possible outcome that you miss the best possible one. Standing right beside you in creek mud with better wire than you brought. Clara stirred on her blanket. Eliza moved to check on her, and Wade watched them both. His daughter waking up blinking, and his wife smoothing Clara's hair back with the easy competence she brought to everything. And the creek ran on behind them, neither knowing nor caring about any of it, carrying the snowmelt down from the ridge the same way it always had, crossing the old property line where the fence post still stood, finding its own way through. He had found his. That was enough. More than enough. It was, he understood now, sitting on the bank of the creek in the evening light with everything he hadn't known he was building toward, finally assembled around him, the whole point. Not the absence of loss, the presence of something worth the risk.